What if the three fruits in your hand held the power to crown you queen or condemn you to death? What if the boy who saved you was the one destined to rule beside you? And what if the mockery that broke your heart was the very moment your true destiny began? Tonight, we follow Lyra, a girl with nothing but dried apricots and a heart too big for a world that sees her as worthless. But when those same fruits reveal an ancient symbol, when a disguised prince recognizes what no one else can see, when the rejection that should have destroyed her becomes the catalyst for a kingdom's salvation, you'll discover that sometimes the most powerful magic comes wrapped in the simplest gifts. If you're ready to feel every humiliation transform into triumph, every whispered prophecy come alive, every impossible love story that could reshape a realm, hit subscribe and let the legend begin. The morning sun carved golden lines through the royal market square, but Lyra felt none of its warmth as she approached Master Gorvek's silk pavilion. Her fingers trembled around the small cloth pouch containing her only treasures, 3 perfectly preserved apricots that somehow never rotted, never lost their golden sheen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to trade the only beautiful things she owned for a chance to be beautiful herself, just for one night. "Please, Master Gorvek," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning bustle. "I know they're just dried fruits, but they're special. They've been in my family for—" The merchant's laugh cut through her words like a blade through silk. His meaty hand swept across his display, knocking bolts of fabric aside as if her very presence contaminated them. "Special? Girl, I've seen moldy bread with more value than whatever scraps you're peddling." The crowd began to gather, drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. Lyra felt their eyes on her patched dress, her calloused hands, her too thin frame that spoke of too many missed meals. "I should have known better," she thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I should have known that girls like me don't get to dream of dancing in palaces." But even as shame burned in her chest, something deeper flickered, a stubborn flame that refused to die. "They're not ordinary fruits," she said, louder this time, straightening her spine. "If you just look closely—" "Look?" Gorvek's bellow echoed across the square, and suddenly every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward them, and Lyra felt herself shrinking under the weight of their attention. "You want me to look at rotten fruit? You think I'm some fool who—" His hand shot out, striking the pouch from her grasp. The 3 apricots scattered across the cobblestones like golden tears, rolling to form a perfect triangle at the feet of the gathering crowd. But in that moment of absolute humiliation, as laughter rippled through the market like poison, something extraordinary happened. A young man in a worn brown cloak pushed through the crowd, his green eyes fixed not on Lyra's face, but on the pattern the fruits had made. His breath caught audibly, his hand moving instinctively to cover something beneath his shirt. And for just an instant, Lyra saw recognition flash across his features like lightning in a storm. Who was he? And why did he look at her fallen fruits like they were made of starlight? Prince Kael's world tilted on its axis as he stared at the 3 golden apricots forming the sacred triad of Ethermore, the symbol he'd memorized from ancient prophecies, the mark that had appeared in his dreams since childhood. His hand pressed against the hidden pendant beneath his shirt, the one bearing the same symbol, the one his dying father had pressed into his palm with trembling fingers just weeks before. "When you see the triad in the flesh, my son, you'll know the true heir has returned." The girl before him, dirty, humiliated, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, had no idea what she'd just revealed. Her dark eyes held tears of shame, but underneath, Kael glimpsed something that made his pulse quicken. Fire. Unbroken, unquenchable fire. "Miss," he said softly, kneeling to gather her fruits with reverent hands. "Your apricots. Where did you get them?" His voice emerged rougher than intended, heavy with barely contained urgency. Lyra blinked up at the stranger, confusion warring with embarrassment in her expression. There was something about him, the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his voice carried the crisp accent of the upper districts, that made her suddenly aware of every patch on her dress, every callus on her palms. They were my mother's," she whispered, accepting the fruits from his outstretched hands. "I've had them since I was small. They're all I have left of her." "Your mother," Kael repeated, his mind racing through genealogy charts and bloodline records. The official histories claimed Queen Valeria's daughter had died in the fire that consumed the Summer Palace 18 years ago. But what was your mother's name? he asked, trying to keep desperation from his voice. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, the entertainment over, but Master Gorvek's cruel laughter still rang in the air like a curse. Behind them, unnoticed in the shadows of a spice vendor's stall, Counselor Aldrich watched with calculating eyes. His network of informants had whispered rumors of a girl in the lower quarter, who never seemed to age, whose touch could heal, whose very presence made plants grow faster. He dismissed such tales as peasant superstition. Until now. Until he saw his prince kneeling before a commoner, with the reverence one reserved for royalty. If the girl lives, Aldrich thought, his hand moving to the poison blade concealed in his robes, then everything I've built crumbles to dust. What did Prince Kael see in those fruits that no one else could? And why did a girl with no memory of her mother's name suddenly feel like she was standing at the edge of a precipice? Lyra stumbled through the familiar maze of narrow alleys that led home, the stranger's questions echoing in her mind like church bells. Her fingers clutched the 3 apricots so tightly they should have bruised, but as always, they remained perfect, unmarked by time or pressure. The young man had looked at them like they held secrets, had spoken to her like she mattered, and the memory of his green eyes made something flutter dangerously in her chest. Naya was waiting by the window when Lyra pushed through the creaking door of their tiny cottage, her weathered face etched with worry that seemed deeper than usual. At 93, Naya moved like winter itself, slowly, carefully, but with an enduring strength that had been Lyra's anchor through 18 years of questions without answers. "Child," she said, her voice heavy with something that might have been fear. "I saw you in the market square. I saw the young man who spoke to you. He asked about Mother," Lyra said, sinking onto the stool beside Naya's chair. "About her name. I couldn't tell him because I don't know. You've never told me." The accusation hung in the air between them, gentle but persistent. Lyra had stopped pressing for details years ago, accepting Naya's explanations about finding her as a baby, about having no knowledge of her parents. But the stranger's urgency, his recognition, had awakened old hungers for truth. Naya's gnarled hands shook as she reached for a wooden box hidden beneath her bed, a box Lyra had seen countless times but never been allowed to touch. "Your mother," Naya whispered, her voice cracking like autumn leaves, "was Queen Valeria of Ethermore. And those fruits you carry, they're not just dried apricots, child. They're seeds. Seeds of power that have been waiting 18 years to bloom." The world seemed to shift around Lyra, reality reorganizing itself into impossible new shapes. Queen Valeria, the beloved queen who had died in the palace fire, along with her infant daughter. Except, Lyra stared at her reflection in the cottage's cracked mirror, searching for any resemblance to the painted portraits she'd seen in the market. Dark hair like shadows, eyes the color of storm clouds, skin that had never quite burned despite hours in the sun. "I'm nobody special," she thought desperately. "I'm just me." "She came to me the night she died," Naya continued, her voice growing stronger as if telling the truth had freed something inside her. "Bleeding, exhausted, but determined to save you. She pressed those fruits into my hands and made me promise to raise you as my own until the day came when Ethermore needed its true queen." Naya's eyes met Lyra's, bright with unshed tears. "That day, my precious girl, is today." If Lyra was truly the lost princess, why had she grown up in poverty? And what did it mean that her mother's final gift was awakening just as a mysterious prince had recognized her destiny? In the highest tower of Ethermore Palace, Prince Kael stood before an ancient tapestry depicting the royal bloodline, his finger tracing the face of Queen Valeria with reverent precision. She had been beautiful. Everyone agreed on that. But more than beauty, the artists had captured something indefinable in her painted eyes. Compassion, perhaps, or the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself with sword or crown. The girl in the market had those same eyes. "Your Highness seems troubled." Counselor Aldrich's voice cut through Kyle's reverie like ice through silk. The older man glided into the chamber with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades learning to move without making sound, a skill that had served him well in his rise to power. "Perhaps you'd share what weighs so heavily on your mind." Kael turned slowly, studying the man who had been his father's closest advisor, who had guided the kingdom through King Theron's final illness, who now essentially ruled Ethermore in all but name. Aldrich's face showed nothing but paternal concern, but something in his pale blue eyes made Cale's instincts prickle with warning. "Just thinking about the legends," Cale said carefully. "About signs and prophecies. About whether the stories our fathers told us might be more than mere tales." "Ah, the romanticism of youth," Aldrich chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Your father, God rest his soul, was also prone to seeing magic in mundane things. It's a charming trait, but perhaps not the most practical for a future king." His words carried the gentle reproach of a teacher correcting a beloved but foolish student. Yet underneath, Cale heard something else. Calculation. Fear, perhaps. "Tell me about the night Queen Valeria died," Cale said suddenly, watching Aldrich's face for any flicker of reaction. About the fire. About her daughter. It was a risk, revealing his interest so directly. But something about the girl's 3 perfect fruits, about the way they'd fallen into that sacred pattern, made patience impossible. The tapestry seemed to mock him with its painted promises of bloodlines and destiny. Aldrich's expression didn't change, but Cale caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible pause before he answered. "A tragedy beyond measure," the counselor said smoothly. "The queen and her child perished in the flames. Their bodies were unrecognizable, of course, but we found the royal seals in the ruins. Sometimes, Your Highness, it's kinder to let the dead rest in peace, rather than chase shadows born of grief and wishful thinking." But as Aldrich spoke, Cale's mind wandered to other questions, darker possibilities. What if the bodies in the fire hadn't been royal at all? What if someone had needed the true heirs gone, had arranged for their disappearance, had spent 18 years building a kingdom on a foundation of lies? And what if that someone was standing in this very room, spinning concerned words while his eyes calculated the cost of exposed truths? Why did Aldrich seem so eager to dismiss the possibility of survivors? And what would happen if Prince Cale discovered that the girl with Stormcloud eyes was everything the kingdom had lost, and everything Aldrich had spent years trying to forget? Elena Brightweave had always known she was different, but she'd learned to hide the pointed tips of her ears beneath carefully arranged hair, to suppress the way her fingers could coax silver thread to shine like starlight, to pretend that the whispered conversations of plants were just imagination. Half-elven blood was dangerous in Ethermore. The old prejudices ran deep, and even her father's successful tailoring business couldn't protect her from suspicion if the truth emerged. But watching Lyra's humiliation in the market square had awakened something fierce and protective in Elena's chest. She'd seen the way the light had seemed to bend around Lyra's fruits, had felt the unmistakable pulse of ancient magic radiating from those 3 simple apricots. More than that, she'd recognized the look in the girl's eyes, the stubborn dignity of someone who'd been told their whole life they were worthless, but refused to believe it. "Father," Elena said that evening as they worked by lamplight in their shop, "the girl who was mocked today, there was something about her, something important. Her elven heritage had gifted her with the ability to sense magical bloodlines, and Lyra's aura had blazed like a beacon. Not the wild, untrained magic of hedge witches or forest sprites, but something deeper, something royal." Marcus Brightweave looked up from the emerald gown he was hemming for Lady Seraphina's latest commission, his kind eyes curious but patient. He'd learned long ago not to dismiss his daughter's insights. Her mixed blood gave her perspectives that pure humans lacked. "What kind of something, little Starlight?" he asked, using the childhood nickname that always made Elena smile despite her 18 years. "The kind that changes kingdoms," Elena whispered, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the silver pendant hidden beneath her bodice, a gift from her elven mother, before she'd disappeared into the whispering woods. "Father, what if the stories about Queen Valeria's daughter were wrong? What if she didn't die in the fire?" The question hung between them like a prayer and a threat, heavy with implications that could reshape their world. Outside their shop window, shadows moved with purpose through the cobblestone streets. Aldrich's agents were already spreading through the lower quarter, asking questions about a girl with unusual fruits, a girl who didn't seem to age, a girl whose very existence threatened the careful order of the kingdom. Elena's elven senses picked up their presence like the scent of smoke on the wind, and her heart began to race with premonition. "I have to find her," Elena thought, her hand moving to gather supplies that might help a royal heir hide from those who would see her dead. "I have to warn her before they—" But even as the thought formed, she heard the distant sound of breaking glass, the muffled cry of an old woman in distress, and knew with sick certainty that she might already be too late. Why were armed men moving through the streets toward the lower quarter? And what would Elena discover when she reached the cottage where a lost princess was about to learn that some destinies came with a price written in blood? The sound of splintering wood tore through the night like a scream. Lyra jolted upright from where she'd been sitting in stunned silence, processing Naya's revelations, just as 3 cloaked figures burst through their cottage door. Moonlight caught the steel of their blades, and in that instant, Lyra understood with crystal clarity that this was no random robbery. These men had come for her. "The girl," the largest assassin growled, his voice muffled behind a black mask. "Where is the girl with the fruits?" Naya stepped protectively in front of Lyra, her frail body seeming to grow taller, more imposing, as if 18 years of hiding had fallen away to reveal the warrior she'd once been. "You'll have to go through me first," she said, and her voice carried an authority that made the assassins hesitate for just a moment. That moment was all Lyra needed. Terror and something deeper, something that felt like liquid fire in her veins, exploded through her body. The 3 apricots in her pocket began to glow with golden light, and suddenly, the air around her hands shimmered with power she'd never known she possessed. "I won't let them hurt her," Lyra thought fiercely. "I won't let them hurt the only mother I've ever known." The magic erupted from her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The golden shield that materialized between them and the assassins was beautiful, woven from light and will and desperate love, but it was also unstable, flickering like a candle in wind, and Lyra could feel her untrained power beginning to consume itself. She'd never done magic before, had never even known she could, and the effort of maintaining the barrier was draining her life force faster than blood from an open wound. Just as her vision began to blur, just as the shield started to crack under the assassin's renewed assault, the cottage window exploded inward in a shower of silver light. Elena Brightweave landed gracefully in the center of the chaos, her hidden elven heritage fully revealed as pointed ears caught the moonlight, and her fingers wove spells with practiced precision. "Get away from them," she commanded, and her voice carried the authority of the ancient forests. The assassins' weapons turned to ash in their hands, and they fled into the night, like shadows before dawn. But the victory felt hollow as Lyra collapsed to her knees, her power spent, and saw Naya lying motionless in a pool of spreading crimson. The old woman's eyes found hers across the wreckage of their home, and her lips moved in words too faint to hear. Elena knelt beside them, her elven magic already reaching out to assess the damage, but the look in her storm-gray eyes told Lyra everything she needed to know. Why had the assassins known exactly where to find her? And what final secret was Naya trying to whisper with her dying breath? The palace guards who arrived at Prince Kael's urgent summons found a scene that would haunt their dreams. A cottage destroyed, an old woman clinging to life, and 2 young women whose combined magic had left scorch marks on the very stones. Kael took one look at Lyra's tear-streaked face, at the way she cradled Naya's head in her lap, like she could hold her soul in place through will alone, and made a decision that would change everything. "Lady Elena, Lady Lyra," he said formally, though his voice shook with emotion. "By royal decree, I place you both under the protection of the crown. Any who would harm you must answer to me." The words carried the weight of ancient law, but more than that, they carried promise. As they lifted Naya onto a stretcher, as palace healers surrounded her with herbs and magic, Lyra felt something shift in the way Kael looked at her. Recognition, yes, but also something deeper. Something that made her heart race despite the terror of the night. The guest chambers they were given in the palace's east wing were more luxurious than anything Lyra had ever imagined. Silk hangings in deep blue and silver, a bed large enough for 3 people, windows that overlooked gardens where night-blooming jasmine filled the air with perfume. But luxury felt meaningless when Naya lay unconscious in the healer's ward, when every shadow might hide another assassin, when the weight of a crown she'd never wanted pressed down on her shoulders like a stone. "You saved my life tonight," Lyra said to Elena, as they sat vigil together, watching the palace healers work their magic on Naya's still form. "You revealed yourself, risked everything, for someone you barely know. Why?" The question had been burning in her chest since Elena's dramatic rescue, along with a dozen others. How had Elena known to come? How had she learned to fight like that? And why did her presence feel so familiar, so right? Elena's smile was soft, but edged with old pain. Because I've spent my whole life hiding what I am, pretending to be something smaller and safer. But when I saw you in that market square, saw the way you refused to bow even when the whole world was laughing at you." She paused, her fingers tracing the silver pendant at her throat. "I realized that some things are worth revealing yourself for. Some people are worth the risk." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft click of the chamber door opening. Prince Kael entered carrying a tray of food and wearing an expression of barely controlled worry. In the lamplight, without his common disguise, he was devastatingly handsome, all sharp cheekbones and green eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. But more than his beauty, it was the way he moved around her, careful and reverent, that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. "The healers say Naya will live," he said softly, setting the tray down with hands that trembled slightly. "Her injuries were severe, but elven magic works differently than human healing. Lady Elena's intervention may have saved more than just her life." His eyes met Lyra's across the chamber, and in them she saw questions he couldn't yet ask, truths he couldn't yet speak. What was Prince Kael not telling her about her rescue? And why did she have the growing certainty that her presence in the palace was less about protection and more about a destiny she wasn't ready to face? 3 days passed in a blur of palace routine and mounting tension. Lyra found herself caught between worlds, too common for the noble ladies who whispered behind silk fans, too royal for the servants who bowed when she passed. Only Elena seemed to understand the vertigo of existing between identities, and only Prince Kael looked at her without calculating her worth or measuring her against expectations she didn't understand. It was during one of their evening walks in the palace gardens that Kael finally found the courage to speak the truth that had been burning in his chest since that first moment in the market square. They'd stopped beside a fountain carved with symbols that seemed vaguely familiar to Lyra, spirals and crescents that made her fingers itch to trace their patterns. "Lyra," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "There are things I need to tell you, things about who you are, about why those men came for you." "I know who I am," Lyra replied, but her voice lacked conviction. The palace mirrors showed her the same face she'd always known, but lately she'd begun to notice things, the way her eyes caught light like gems, the way her posture straightened instinctively when servants approached, the way ancient languages seemed to whisper meaning in her mind. "I'm nobody special, just a girl who got caught up in something bigger than herself." Kael's laugh was soft but edged with pain. "You're so much more than that, and I think part of you has always known." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a pendant she'd seen him touch unconsciously a dozen times, a silver disc bearing 3 interconnected circles, each containing a perfect gemstone. "This was my father's, and his father's before him. It bears the symbol of our kingdom's greatest treasure, the lost royal line of Ethermore." The pendant caught moonlight and threw it back in patterns that made Lyra's heart race with inexplicable recognition. Without thinking, she reached for the simple wooden locket Naya had given her years ago, the one she'd always assumed contained pressed flowers or a child's drawing. But when she opened it for the first time in Kael's presence, they both gasped. Inside, preserved by magic she hadn't known existed, was a perfect apricot seed, and surrounding it, carved into the wood itself, was the same triple circle symbol. "Queen Valeria's daughter didn't die in the fire," Kael whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "She was saved, hidden, raised by a woman brave enough to sacrifice everything to protect her. And now," he stepped closer, close enough that Lyra could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could see the way his pupils dilated when he looked at her. "Now she's standing in front of me, beautiful and brave and completely unaware that she's the rightful queen of Ethermore." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of herself, of her life, of the future that suddenly stretched before her like an uncharted ocean. "Queen," she thought, the word feeling foreign and impossible in her mind. "He thinks I'm meant to be queen." But even as panic rose in her throat, even as every instinct screamed that she wasn't ready, wasn't worthy, wasn't enough, she felt something else stirring. Something that felt like coming home. If she truly was the lost princess, what did that mean for her feelings toward Prince Kael? And what forces in the kingdom would kill to prevent her from claiming her birthright? Counselor Aldrich stood before the great map of Ethermore in his private study, red pins marking the locations where his network of spies had reported unusual magical activity. 3 pins formed a triangle around the lower quarter where Lyra had lived. 5 more clustered around the palace where she now resided, and a single black pin marked the site where his assassins had failed so spectacularly. 18 years of careful planning, of positioning himself as the kingdom's indispensable advisor, and it could all crumble because of one girl who should have died as a baby. "My lord," his lieutenant whispered from the doorway, "the prince has been seen walking with the girl in the gardens. They seem close." The man's hesitation spoke volumes. In a kingdom where royal marriages were matters of state, where alliances were forged in bedroom negotiations and broken by morning discoveries, the prince's obvious attachment to a supposed commoner was more than scandalous. It was dangerous. Aldrich's fingers drummed against the map's wooden frame as his mind calculated possibilities. If Chaol married the girl believing her to be a commoner, the union could be annulled when her true identity was revealed, assuming anyone lived to reveal it. But if the prince already suspected, if he was courting her knowing she might be the lost heir, "Double the guards around my chambers," Aldrich commanded, "and prepare the tears of sorrow." The poison known as tears of sorrow was Aldrich's most prized possession, a rare compound that mimicked the symptoms of heartbreak so perfectly that its victims appeared to die of grief rather than murder. Colorless, odorless, and virtually undetectable, it had served him well in eliminating obstacles over the years. Queen Valeria herself had succumbed to its kiss, though the world believed she'd perished in flames. One drop in the right wine glass, and the girl who threatened everything would simply fade away. But as Aldrich prepared his final gambit, as he planned the dinner party that would serve as both celebration and execution, he failed to notice the shadow that detached itself from his study's curtains. Elena Brightweave had spent 3 days mapping the palace's secret passages, using her elven heritage to move unseen through spaces too narrow for human guards. What she'd discovered in Aldrich's private conversations, in his coded correspondence, in the way his eyes followed Lyra with calculating hatred, it changed everything. The revelation that Counselor Aldrich had orchestrated Queen Valeria's death, had spent 18 years consolidating power while hunting for any surviving heirs, hit Elena like a physical blow. But more terrifying was the realization that he was preparing to strike again, and this time, his target was the girl Elena had sworn to protect. As she slipped back through the shadows toward Lyra's chambers, Elena's mind raced with the urgency of limited time and impossible choices. How could Elena warn Lyra and Chaol about Aldrich's plans without revealing her own dangerous infiltration? And what would happen when the kingdom's most powerful man discovered that his greatest secret was no longer safe? The grand dining hall glittered with 1,000 candles, their light dancing off crystal goblets and silver plate in a display of wealth that made Lyra's head spin. She'd been fitted for the occasion in a gown of midnight blue silk that transformed her from commoner to vision, though she still felt like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's dreams. Across the table, Prince Chaol watched her with undisguised admiration, while beside her, Elena maintained the careful composure of a noble's daughter, despite the tension radiating from her small frame. "Lady Lyra," Counselor Aldrich said smoothly as servants filled their wine glasses with pale golden vintage, "you seem to have adapted remarkably well to palace life. One might almost think you were born to it." His words carried layers of meaning that made Lyra's skin crawl, though she couldn't quite identify why. There was something in his pale eyes that reminded her of winter ice, beautiful but deadly, capable of cutting deep without warning. The evening progressed through 7 courses of delicacies Lyra had never imagined, each accompanied by wine that grew stronger and headier as the night wore on. She found herself laughing at Lord Marius's hunting stories, debating philosophy with Lady Seraphina, accepting compliments on her natural grace with growing confidence. For the first time since learning of her supposed heritage, she began to believe that perhaps she could learn to be royal, could grow into the crown that awaited her. It was during the final course, honey cakes that reminded her painfully of Naya's simple cooking, that Elena's hand suddenly gripped her wrist beneath the table. The touch was ice-cold and urgent, and when Lyra glanced sideways, she saw stark terror in her friend's storm-gray eyes. Elena's elven senses had detected something the humans had missed, the faint acrid scent of poison in Lyra's wine glass, the subtle magical signature of death magic woven into what should have been celebration. "Don't drink," Elena whispered, so quietly that only elven ears could have caught the words. But Aldrich's attention was already focused on them like a hawk watching mice. his hand moving in a gesture that Lyra suddenly recognized as the signal she'd seen him give his guards. Around the table, conversations continued normally, but underneath the veneer of civility, a deadly game was reaching its climax. Prince Kael raised his own goblet in a toast, his green eyes warm with affection as they met Lyra's across the candlelit table. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice rich with promise and possibility, "and to the courage to claim what's rightfully ours." The irony was devastating. As he spoke of claiming rights and facing destiny, the woman he was falling in love with sat frozen between salvation and destruction, her wineglass trembling in her hand like a captured bird. Would Elena's warning be enough to save Lyra from Aldrich's poison? And what would happen when the counselor realized his carefully laid trap had been discovered? The wineglass shattered against the marble floor, like Lyra's last illusion of safety. The sound cut through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk, and suddenly every eye in the grand hall was fixed on her trembling form. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heartbeat. I'm not feeling well." But even as she spoke, she watched Aldrich's face transform, surprise giving way to calculation, then to cold fury as he realized his perfect plan had somehow gone awry. "No matter," Aldrich said smoothly, rising from his chair with predatory grace. "Perhaps some fresh air would help. Guards, please escort Lady Lyra to her chambers." But the men who stepped forward weren't the usual palace guards. These were the same masked figures who had attacked her cottage, and Lyra felt ice form in her veins as she recognized the cruel gleam in their eyes. Elena moved faster than human sight could follow, her elven heritage finally unleashed in a blur of silver light and deadly precision. Her dinner knife became a weapon in her hands, parrying the first guard's blade, while her free hand wove protective spells around Lyra's frozen form. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "Find Prince Kael and tell him—" But her words were cut off as more guards poured into the hall, and the elegant dinner party transformed into a battlefield. Prince Kael's roar of outrage shook the crystal chandeliers as he drew his sword in one fluid motion, placing himself between Lyra and the advancing assassins. "By what right do you draw steel in my father's hall?" he demanded, but his eyes were already counting opponents, calculating odds, recognizing the cold truth that they were outnumbered 3-1. The noble guests screamed and fled, their silk gowns and velvet doublets, a chaotic blur of color against the backdrop of violence. But it was Lyra herself who changed everything, as terror and fury built in her chest like a gathering storm, as she watched Elena bleeding from a dozen small cuts while defending her, as she saw Kael surrounded by enemies who cared nothing for his royal blood. Something inside her snapped. The 3 apricots in her pocket erupted with golden light, and suddenly the air around her hands blazed with power that made the palace stones themselves sing in recognition. "I am Lyra of Ethermore," she thought, the words echoing in her mind like a coronation vow. "And I will not watch my friends die for my cowardice." The magic that poured from her was nothing like the desperate shield she'd created in the cottage. This was controlled, purposeful, beautiful in its devastating precision. Golden chains of light wrapped around the assassin's weapons, turning steel to flower petals. Barriers of crystallized air protected her friends, while waves of healing energy washed over Elena's wounds. And through it all, Aldrich watched with the expression of a man seeing his worst nightmare come to life. What would happen now that Lyra had revealed her true power before the entire court? And how would Aldrich respond to the undeniable proof that the girl he'd tried to kill was everything he'd feared she might be? Silence fell over the ruined dining hall like a shroud as the last assassin's weapon crumbled to dust in Lyra's golden grip. The noble guests who hadn't fled stood frozen in the doorways, their faces pale with shock and something that might have been awe. In the center of it all, Counselor Aldrich stood alone, his careful mask of paternal concern finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "Remarkable," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with deadly calm. 18 years I've searched for any trace of royal magic, any hint that Valeria's line might have survived. And here you are, child, blazing like a star in the darkness." He began to walk toward her, his hands empty, but his presence radiating menace like heat from a forge. "Do you know what you've just done? What you've just revealed to everyone in this room?" Prince Kael stepped protectively in front of Lyra, his sword still drawn, but Aldrich's laughter was soft and genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear prince. Still playing the hero, I see. But tell me, what will you do when the kingdom learns that you've been harboring a pretender? When they discover that their beloved counselor has spent years protecting them from the return of a bloodline that brought nothing but war and suffering?" "You're lying," Lyra said, but her voice shook with uncertainty. The power still coursed through her veins like liquid fire, but with it came flashes of memory that weren't her own. Visions of battlefields soaked in blood, of cities burning, of magic wielded without wisdom or restraint. What if he's right? She thought desperately. What if my bloodline is cursed? What if I'm meant to bring destruction instead of salvation? Elena moved to stand beside Kale, her elven heritage no longer hidden, her storm-gray eyes blazing with protective fury. "The only pretender here is you, Aldrich," she said, her voice carrying the authority of ancient bloodlines. "The elves remember the true history, how Queen Valeria brought peace, how her magic healed the land, how her death plunged the kingdom into the slow decay we see today." She gestured to the cracked marble, the faded tapestries, the sense of entropy that had been creeping through the palace for 18 years. Aldrich's expression darkened as he realized that Elena represented more than just a half-elven ally. She was a witness to truths he'd spent decades trying to bury. "The elves," he spat, "always meddling in human affairs, always believing they know what's best for kingdoms they've never ruled." His hand moved to his robes, and Lyra caught the glint of steel hidden in the folds. Perhaps it's time the last of the old bloodlines joined their predecessors in the grave. The blade that emerged from Aldrich's sleeve was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Black metal that seemed to drink light, etched with runes that made her magical senses recoil in revulsion. This wasn't just a weapon. It was an artifact of shadow magic, designed specifically to cut through royal power and drain the life from those who wielded it. As Aldrich raised the cursed blade, as his lips began to form words in a language that predated kingdoms, Lyra realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment when everything would be decided. Could Lyra's newfound power stand against a weapon forged specifically to destroy her bloodline? And what price would she have to pay to protect the kingdom that was finally accepting her as its queen? The shadow blade cut through the air toward Lyra's heart like a fragment of midnight given form, but her golden magic rose to meet it with the fury of a star refusing to die. The collision sent shockwaves through the dining hall that shattered every piece of crystal, every mirror, every delicate thing that couldn't withstand the meeting of opposing forces. Light and darkness spiraled around each other in a deadly dance while the very foundations of the palace groaned under the strain. "You cannot win, child," Aldrich snarled, his face contorting with effort as he poured more power into the cursed weapon. "This blade has tasted the blood of every royal heir for 3 generations. It knows the taste of your line, knows how to unmake the very essence of what you are." The shadow magic writhed around him like living smoke, transforming his appearance into something barely human. Eyes like black pits, skin pale as bone, fingers extended into claws that scraped against reality itself. But Lyra was no longer the frightened girl who had been mocked in the market square. Power flowed through her like a river finding its course, and with it came understanding that transcended her 18 years of ignorance. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "This blade does know my bloodline. But what you never understood, Aldrich, is that royal magic isn't about power over others. It's about sacrifice for them." Elena gasped as she recognized what Lyra was preparing to do, her elven senses picking up the shift in magical currents that meant her friend was about to attempt something that could either save the kingdom or destroy herself in the process. "Lyra, no!" she cried, reaching out with her own magic to try to stop what was coming. "There has to be another way." Prince Kale, still positioned between Lyra and the worst of the shadow magic's effects, suddenly understood as well. The look in Lyra's storm-cloud eyes was the same one his father had worn on his deathbed, the expression of someone who had found peace in the knowledge that some things were worth any price. "I won't let you face this alone," he said firmly, his hand finding hers despite the magical fire that surrounded them both. "If you're determined to save this kingdom, then we do it together." The moment their fingers interlocked, something extraordinary happened. Lyra's golden magic and Kale's royal bloodline began to resonate, creating harmonies of power that neither could have achieved alone. The shadow blade, designed to corrupt and drain individual magic, found itself facing something it had never encountered. The willing union of 2 royal lines, freely given, strengthened by love, rather than diminished by it. Aldrich's scream of rage and terror echoed through the hall as his ultimate weapon began to crack under the assault of unified light. But even as victory seemed within reach, Lyra felt the terrible cost of channeling so much power. Her life force was burning away like candle wax in flame, and she knew with devastating clarity that saving the kingdom might require everything she had to give. Could love really be stronger than the darkest magic? And what would happen to Lyra and Chaol if their united power proved too much for mortal forms to contain? The shadow blade shattered like black glass, its fragments dissolving into wisps of darkness that fled the blazing light of united royal magic. Aldrich staggered backward, his face a mask of disbelief and growing horror, as 18 years of careful planning crumbled around him like a house built on lies. But even as his ultimate weapon failed, even as his grand design collapsed, the counselor's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, no sanity, only the cold satisfaction of a man prepared to drag everyone into the abyss with him. "If I cannot rule," he whispered, his voice carrying impossible distance through the ruined hall, "then let there be nothing left to rule." The words were more than threat. They were incantation. Ancient magic, older and darker than the kingdom itself, began to seep up through the palace foundations like poison through cracked stone. This was Aldrich's final gambit, a curse that would drain the life from every living thing in Ethermoor, leaving only a wasteland as monument to his thwarted ambitions. Lyra felt the curse's tendrils reaching for her people, for the servants cowering in the kitchens, for the children sleeping in the lower quarter, for every innocent soul who had never asked to be caught in the crossfire of royal politics. The weight of their potential deaths pressed against her heart like a physical thing, and she knew with terrible certainty what had to be done. "The curse needs a royal life to anchor it," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "But it also needs a royal life to break it." "No," Prince Chaol said fiercely, his grip on her hand tightening as he realized what she was suggesting. "There has to be another way. There's always another way." But even as he spoke, he could feel the curse spreading through the palace like infection through a wound, could sense the life being slowly drained from everything it touched. Time was running out, and they both knew it. Elena stepped forward, her elven magic weaving protective barriers around the few remaining nobles, buying them precious moments to find a solution. "The old legends speak of shared sacrifice," she said urgently, her mind racing through half-remembered stories from her mother's people. "If two royal bloodlines willingly give their power to save their people, the magic can be distributed, diluted. You don't have to die, but you might—" She hesitated, understanding the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "We might lose our magic forever," Lyra finished softly, meeting Chaol's eyes across the space between them. "We could live, but as ordinary people. No more royal power, no more golden light, no more connection to the ancient bloodlines." The thought should have been terrifying, after just discovering her heritage, to lose it again so quickly. But instead, Lyra felt only peace. "I never wanted to be a queen anyway," she thought. "I only wanted to save the people I love." Chaol's answer came without hesitation, his love shining in his green eyes brighter than any crown. "Then let's save our kingdom," he said simply. "And let's build our life on something stronger than magic or birthright." Together, they began to weave their combined power into a net of protection that would shelter Ethermoor from Aldrich's dying curse, knowing that each thread they spun was another piece of their royal heritage given freely away. Would their sacrifice be enough to save the kingdom? And what kind of future awaited two people who had chosen love over power, service over sovereignty? The curse shattered like ice in spring sunlight as Lyra and Chaol poured their combined heritage into the protective web that now covered all of Ethermoor. Where the dark magic had sought to drain and destroy, their sacrifice brought healing. Wounds closed, withered plants bloomed, and the very stones of the palace seemed to sigh with relief as life flowed back into them. Counselor Aldrich aged decades in moments, his stolen power abandoning him as the natural order reasserted itself, leaving behind only a broken old man who crumpled to the marble floor with a whisper of defeated breath. In the aftermath, as palace guards secured the scene and healers tended to the wounded, Lyra felt the last of her royal magic fade away, like the final notes of a beautiful song. The golden light that had blazed around her hands was gone. the connection to ancient bloodlines severed by her willing choice. But instead of loss, she felt free. I am no longer a queen, she thought, marveling at how right the words felt. I am simply Lyra, and that is enough. Prince Kyle, now just Kyle she supposed, caught her as her knees buckled from exhaustion, his arms strong and warm around her waist. He had lost his magic too, she could tell, but his smile was radiant as he looked down at her. No regrets? He asked softly, and she knew he was asking about more than just the power they'd given up. He was asking about kingdoms and crowns, about the ordinary life they'd chosen instead of the extraordinary one that had been their birthright. None, she whispered, meaning it completely. We saved them, Kyle. We saved everyone. Around them, the surviving nobles were already discussing succession, debating who would rule in the absence of clear royal heirs, but their arguments felt distant and unimportant. Elena approached them with tears in her storm-gray eyes, her elven magic intact, but her expression mixed with grief and pride. The council has chosen Lord Marius as regent until a proper succession can be established, Elena reported, her voice soft with exhaustion. And they've decided that 2 people who sacrificed their birthright to save the kingdom deserve a reward more precious than any crown. She gestured toward the great windows where dawn was breaking over Ethermoor, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Lyra of her mother's apricots. 6 months later, Lyra stood in the garden behind the cottage that Kale had built for them on the outskirts of the capital. Not the hovel where she'd grown up, but a proper home with room for the life they were building together. Her hands, calloused again from honest work, tended to the apricot trees they'd planted from the 3 magical seeds that had somehow survived their sacrifice. The trees bore normal fruit now, sweet and mortal, but Lyra had never tasted anything more perfect. Elena visited often, serving as the kingdom's official liaison to the elven territories, her dual heritage finally a source of strength rather than shame. And sometimes, when the light caught the apricots just right, when the wind carried the scent of growing things, Lyra could swear she felt Naya's presence in the garden, proud, peaceful, and finally able to rest, knowing that her girl had found her way home. No more royal fairs for us, Kyle said, appearing behind her with dirt on his hands and joy in his green eyes. But I hear there's a harvest festival next month. Think they'll let a former prince and a reformed queen sell fruit at the market? Lyra's laughter was bright as golden sunshine as she turned into his arms, 3 perfect apricots cupped in her palms, not magical anymore, but precious beyond measure. They'd better, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him among the trees that had grown from sacrifice and bloomed into love. After all, we've got the best fruit in the kingdom. And so ends the tale of the girl who paid with dried fruits and discovered she was a queen, only to learn that the greatest crown of all was the one she chose to give away. For in the end, true royalty isn't about the power you wield, but about the sacrifices you're willing to make for love. Sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as the simplest things. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are exactly who the world needs to save it. And sometimes the greatest magic of all is choosing to be ordinary, together. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt every emotion alongside Lyra and Kale, if you believe in the magic of love that conquers all, let me know in the comments below. Which moment made your heart race? Which sacrifice brought tears to your eyes? And what other impossible love stories would you like to see come alive? Don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales that will transport you to worlds where love really can change everything.